Well, good evening, everyone. Good to see you all, and welcome to today's webinar in the Skeptical Inquirer Presents series. So today, I'm thrilled to introduce Sam Kean. He's the best-selling author and master storyteller, who tonight will be discussing his great book, Dinner with King Tut. I just finished his book last night, and I can tell you he brings science and history vividly to life. I highly recommend it. It's really neat to listen and read as he uncovers the human stories behind things like mummies and relics and the science that we use to study them. So I've done my fair share of rustic camping, including hacking my way through Manu National Park in the Peruvian Amazon with a machete. And let me tell you, after that experience, I know I would not survive as an early human thousands of years ago, not even close. So I'm grateful Sam gets to tell these stories while I sit here safely in a chair with a microphone. And please, everyone, if you enjoy today's webinar, there's a lot more where that comes from. If we're at SciCon, join us for SciCon 2026. Tickets are now on sale. It's in Buffalo, New York, from June 11th to June 14th, 2026. We have a great lineup of speakers, workshops, conversations, celebrating science and critical thinking. I'll be there giving a workshop on Thursday, so get there early. But let's put that aside right now because I am looking forward to this wonderful webinar tonight. Let's all get together here and welcome our speaker, Sam Kean. Welcome, Sam.
Well, hello. Thank you for having me. Let's get my slides up here. Do I do that? There we go. Okay. Well, great. Thank you, everyone, for joining me. So I always had a bit of a gripe with the field of archaeology because on the one hand, to me, it seemed like the most thrilling field in all of science. It really gets at the deepest questions about human history, who we are, where we came from, how we spread around the earth. These big meaty questions about humanity. But whenever I actually visited an archaeological site, it just seemed like the most boring work I could ever imagine. It was just a bunch of sunburned people sitting around in the dirt, dusting off pot shards with toothbrushes. It looked so tedious. So in my mind, there was this massive disconnect between these stirring conclusions of archaeology and the monotony of the daily work. So you can imagine my delight when I discovered the field of experimental archaeology. Because experimental archaeologists do things. They actively recreate the past. They brew Viking beer. They make human mummies. They drive chariots. They play Aztec ball games. They build rickety ships, and they plunge out into the ocean with all the verve of Indiana Jones. And in fact, some people call it not experimental archaeology, but experiential archaeology, or even living archaeology. It really resurrects the past. And I especially appreciate how sensory rich the field is. You can hear the boom of medieval cannons. You can smell ancient leather. You can eat all sorts of wild and unusual foods. I loved every second of every experience I had. So today I want to talk a little bit about the field of experimental archaeology. And each chapter in this book, Dinner with King Tut, recreates a day in the life of a person from a particular place and a particular time. So you can see there some of the different places that I traveled to and that I talked about in the book. And the book's a bit unusual in that it combines fiction and nonfiction. There are alternating sections of fiction and nonfiction. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm a bit of a cough here. I'm happy to take questions about the fiction during the Q&A. But for right now in the talk, I'm going to focus a bit on the fictional elements, things I actually observed and experienced. And I am going to start with a story that began about 5,300 years ago, when a person died in the Alps on the border of Switzerland and Italy. Fell into or on top of a glacier, kind of got trapped inside the glacier eventually, and was later discovered by hikers when that glacier began to melt in 1991. Very famous, now mummified body, a man named Ötzi. And he was incredibly well preserved. He was so well preserved that we know his last meal. He ate ibex meat and grains for his last meal. We also know that he was murdered. They found an arrow in his back near a major artery. So we know he was shot in the back, probably murdered. And oddly enough, Ötzi is very heavily tattooed. He has 61 tattoos all over his body. Most of them are just tiny lines or crosses. They're pretty modestly sized. You can see where some of them are here. A lot of them are around joints or places you might get aches and pains, things like that. So the leading theory is that they were probably medicinal. You know, he had an ache, a doctor, a medicine person of some sort would come in, give him a tattoo, to say some sort of prayer or something, a ceremony, to try to ease those, those aches and pains. So we know he had these tattoos, but there was always a bit of a mystery about how they applied the tattoos, because obviously they didn't have tattoo guns back then. So how did they get the ink into his skin? And sort of the leading theory archaeologists had was that, okay, this was an older time, and especially, you know, back then they thought that they only had crude tools, crude equipment, things like that. So they theorized that he had used kind of a crude method to apply these tattoos. In particular, the leading theory was that they had taken obsidian, so a nice sharp stone tool, had sliced the skin, and then rubbed soot or some sort of soot-based ink into the wounds, and that's how they deposited the ink under Ötzi's skin. That was kind of the leading theory at the time. But of course, there was no real evidence for this theory. And that's kind of a shortcoming, unfortunately, of certain areas of archaeology. You have people theorizing about hunting who have never hunted before. People theorizing about making leather who have never tanned a hide. People theorizing about tattooing who have never gotten, much less given, a tattoo. And so some experimental archaeologists came along and they said, well, you know, I think we can do this a little better. So they designed an experiment. What they did is they got a tattoo artist in New Zealand who was versed in some traditional tattoo methods, including a sort of a poke method where you take a needle, and you poke the skin and deposit it that way. And an experimental archaeologist talked to him, and they came up with an experiment. What they did was the artist gave himself 8 tattoos using 8 different methods. Sometimes they used the sort of cut and rub method that they think Ötzi might have used, where you cut the skin, rub the ink in. He also applied hand poking tattoos with different types of needles, a bone needle, copper needle, cactus thorn, different things like that. And you can see the tattoo that he applied here, kind of a triangle form stacked on top of each other. Looks a bit like what a child might draw for a Christmas tree, something like that. And this artist gave himself 8 identical tattoos, one using each of the different instruments. He applied them on his left thigh. It was an area that he could reach. And more importantly, it was one of the few spots he had that was not already covered with tattoos. So that's one of the reasons he chose this spot. And he did these 8 tattoos over one long 12-hour day, very grueling day. But the time and the pain was not distributed equally over all of these tattoo methods. Some of them he got done in about 15, 20 minutes. He could work very quickly with those. Other methods, though, took him a lot longer. The one that took him the longest was a method that they used in certain places in the Arctic, where you take a needle, but instead of poking and depositing the ink with the tip of the needle, you actually use sort of a sewing technique where you take the needle, you draw it through the skin, and then there's an ink-soaked thread behind it that then goes through the skin, and it's the thread that actually leaves the ink behind. And he said that that method was kind of awful and grueling. It took him 3 hours to apply the tattoo that way. He said it was excruciating. He would never do it again. But his torment paid off handsomely in scientific insight. Because afterward, he gave himself the tattoo. They documented how long it took to apply each one, how much pain he was in during each one, how long it took to heal. And especially important, they wanted to know what the tattoos looked like afterward. And so here you can see the difference between the obsidian method, the cut and rub method, and one applied with a bone needle. And the differences are with the obsidian one, you can see how it kind of tapers off at the very end, kind of disappears into a little wisp there. And it's also more solid all the way through. Whereas a bone needle one, there's a little bit of a rounder end on it. It stops a little harder. And it's a lot like one of those old dot matrix printers, if you remember those, where it's a bunch of overlapping dots instead of a long line. And from this, they essentially had a reference set of different tattoos. And then they could go to ancient mummies with tattoos, look at them, and try to figure out how these tattoos were applied on the ancient mummies. And lo and behold, they went to Ötzi and found out that he did not get a tattoo through the obsidian method. It did not look like that at all. It looked far more like the bone needle method. So from this fairly simple experiment, we got an insight into how they were applying tattoos 5,300 years ago. And they weren't just using the sort of crude cut and rub method. They had dedicated tools and people who were skilled in this kind of labor. So a cool little insight into their culture. And for the book, I actually got a hand-poked tattoo myself. It was my first tattoo. It was a bit of a debacle. I will leave that for the book. But I did want to talk about one other aspect of something that happened to me while I was getting the tattoo. So after I got the tattoo, the artist was in Los Angeles in Orange County, down there. And I said, well, thank you very much. That was great. It was exactly what I needed. And he said, well, I'm glad to hear that. And then he stopped me and he said, I mean, as long as you're here, dude, you want to give me a tattoo? And I said, well, okay, I'll try to give you a tattoo, I guess. So we switched spots in the chair and I pulled the gloves on and I got to give him a hand-poked tattoo. He got it on his shin. So we essentially rolled the front of his pant leg up on the fleshy part of the shin there. And I said, what do you want? And he said, just give me a little line. I said, I think I can handle that. I'm not the world's best artist, but I'll try. And so I started doing it. But I noticed that he had a bunch of other lines similar to the one that I was giving him on his shin. And I asked him, well, what's going on here? And he started telling me kind of an incredible story. So way back when, in Alaska, upper Alaska, the Arctic there, it was very common for women especially to get facial tattoos. They had different geometric marks they would get on their face. You can see an example here. But then colonial officials came in, missionaries came in, and they essentially wiped the practice out. They prevented people from doing it, and it eventually more or less died out. But there are women alive nowadays who remember their grandmothers and great-grandmothers having these facial tattoos, and there are pictures of them as well. And so these women decided, well, we want to revive the practice. Unfortunately, a lot of the knowledge about how to apply tattooing had been lost. So this guy, down in LA, he actually flew them down and gave them a seminar on tattooing. And then because, of course, knowledge about something like this isn't very good if it's just theoretical, he let them practice tattooing on himself. He rolled his pant leg up for them and essentially let them use his leg as a doodle pad so they could practice tattooing, so they could bring this tradition back. And I just thought it was a really nice example of what experimental archaeology can do. Because there are definitely hardcore lab people doing this type of work, but there are also a lot of people who are, talking to indigenous groups, doing things like that. Some cases, it's the indigenous groups who are telling scientists they know how things were done based on traditions that have been handed down. So there's a lot of back and forth in the field, passing this information along, and really a lot of synergy with the two groups coming together. That's one of the delights of the field, is that it's so new, insight can really come from anywhere. That was one of the delightful things about this new field. And from this, I wanted to move to a different area with mummies and talk a little bit about ancient Egypt. And of course, the one or two things that everyone knows about ancient Egypt are the pyramids, the very iconic pyramids, and also the mummies that were found in ancient Egypt. But it's a bit of an embarrassment for archaeologists in that we don't really know how they built the pyramids. In fact, they know almost nothing about how the pyramids were built. Bit of an embarrassment. I talk a little bit in the book about some theories they have, some experiments they've done to try to figure that out. But I do want to focus a bit on the mummies nowadays, or in this talk, because again, that's something scientists don't know a lot about. We know a little bit more than with the pyramids, but just not a lot of details about how they actually made mummies. So some scientists actually have been doing animal mummies, like you can see here. And animal mummies were actually incredibly common in ancient Egypt. I had no idea how common they were before I started writing this book. The Egyptians mummified pretty much anything they could get their hands on. We have found baboon mummies. We found crocodile mummies. We have found shrews. We found lions. Oops. We have some computer issues here. Hold on, sorry about that. Ooh, something's happening here. Sorry about that. So again, they have found baboons, they have found crocodiles, they found shrews, lions, beetles, hippos, lizards, pretty much anything they could get their hands on, they mummified. And they made these mummies in staggering quantities. There's one grave site they found with 4 million bird mummies in it. And another one, they found 7 million dog mummies. So they were making these on an industrial scale. And scientists have learned in the modern times some things about how they made mummies by making animal mummies, making replicas of them. And so I talk a little bit in the book about that. I made an animal mummy myself, different things like that. But of course, what everyone really wants to know about is human mummies. Everyone decided, though, unfortunately, it would be way too controversial to actually make a human mummy. No one would even try to get away with that, except a few people decided, well, why can't we make a human mummy? Let's try it out. So in 1994, 2 scientists in Baltimore did make a human mummy. You can see one of them here. Oops. One of them here, an Egyptologist named Bob Breyer. And again, in 1994, he got it in his head that he wanted to mummify someone. He had some questions that he wanted to answer while he was doing this. That's kind of the motivation he had for doing it. Things like, how long did it take to make a human mummy? What all steps were involved? What tools did people use? Things like that. So essentially, his partner in this endeavor was head of the state anatomy board in Maryland. And as head of the state anatomy board, that guy had access to bodies donated to medical schools, donated to scientific endeavors, things like that. So they had access to this pool, and they decided to use one of these bodies in this mummification experiment. It was a 76-year-old man who had died of a heart attack. His identity remains a secret today, but they nicknamed him E.M. Balm. So M. Balm Har Har was the nickname that they gave him, just to give him a bit of an identity. And Breyer went all out to be authentic. He made replica copper and obsidian blades, like you can see in the picture here. And he actually flew to Egypt to get the mineral that the Egyptians used for drying out the body. It is a mineral called natron. It's a very simple mineral. You probably have the ingredients in your cabinet right now. It's a mix of baking soda and salt, equal parts of both of them. It forms naturally in dry creek beds, river beds, things like that. So very common, very simple mineral called natron. But again, Breyer wanted to be authentic, so he actually flew to Egypt so he could dig up his own natron in the wadis there, just like what the Egyptians would have used. Then he had to bring it back into the United States. And he said that actually one of the more ticklish aspects of the whole operation was smuggling hundreds of pounds of unidentified white powder back through customs at JFK Airport. But they did get it back successfully, and then they started this experiment. So we did know some steps about mummification based on things we found. For instance, they had to remove the organs one by one. Some were discarded, like the brain. Others were preserved, like the livers, lungs, and heart. Then they washed the inside with wine, and they packed it with linen bags full of natron. Then they used several hundred more pounds of natron. You can see in the picture here that they just piled that natron on top of Mr. Balm and let the process kind of take care of its own. It's a very passive process. You just have to let the natron do its work. And in the book, I go into a lot more detail about what they actually did. But I will point out that it was pretty controversial. There were archaeologists who were furious that he was doing this. They said this was macabre. They said it was tasteless. They said it had no scientific value. And I do think those are fair points about the ethics of this experiment. But I will say they did treat the body with a lot of respect. They treated him like a king, like a pharaoh would have been treated. And it's not true that there was no scientific value here. There were many things we learned about the mummification process. For instance, one important thing they learned is that copper tools just don't cut skin very well. Again, they had to get the inner organs out. And Breyer, when he was starting off, said, well, okay, obviously, if we have a choice between the obsidian tools and the copper tools, I'm going to use the metal, the copper blade. But it turns out copper's not very good at cutting skin. The stone blades were much, much sharper and were able to get through the skin much more easily. Something we didn't know before. We got insight into the process based on this experiment. Another question they had was, well, we've only found on these mummies very small incisions, 2 or 3 inches maybe. Is it really possible to get the liver and the lungs out, or were they cutting them open wider and then sewing them back up? And they learned that actually, yes, if they squeezed and turned and got the organs in the right orientation, they could actually get them out through these very tiny incisions, something we didn't know before. They learned how they actually got the brain out through the nose with that little hook. I will say that for the book, but I bet it's not what you were thinking would happen. They discovered how long the mummification process took, in this case, about 4 months. They discovered how much natron was required, about 800 pounds. They learned how much body weight a mummy loses due to moisture being sucked out. Mr. Baum lost over 100 pounds of just water. And the big question that Breyer always had, I'll go to one more slide here before the next one. This is them wrapping Mr. Baum up at the end. But the big question Breyer had was he always looked, when he would look at a mummy, he noticed that they had this kind of iconic look to them. The skin would kind of tighten on the face and it would shrivel as it dried. The teeth would stick out. You can see an example right here. This is Ramses the Great, kind of a very prototypical look that a mummy has. And Breyer always wanted to know, was this look, this classic look, from the mummification process, or is this from thousands of years in Egypt's desert? And they had to change the natron on Mr. Baum a few times. So let it sit for a while, get it off, put fresh natron on. They had to switch it in and out a few times. And he said, Breyer said, even after the first time they broke open the crust of natron and looked at Mr. Baum, Breyer sort of gasped a little bit and said, oh my God, he looks exactly like Ramses the Great already. So even after just 5 weeks, he learned that it was the embalming process, not the time sitting in Egypt's dry environment, that gave mummies their iconic look, something we would not have known before. And I will say that Mr. Baum is still in Maryland today. He is sitting in an office. As Breyer says, he is dead and well. And in 100 years, I bet he will be looking a lot better than I will. So a very interesting and illuminating experiment there. And I'm going to move on now to another era in Earth's history, another place with pyramids, actually. And that is Mesoamerica, and in particular, the Aztec culture there, or Mexican culture. And I'm going to talk, in the book, I talk about some different aspects of their culture. But here I'm going to talk and focus specifically on a game that I got to participate in, the sort of famous or notorious Mesoamerican ball game. I'm actually going to read a section from the book here, a very short section. But to set that up, I do want to explain a little bit about the Aztec ball game. So as you can see in the picture here, if you're not familiar, there was a ball involved in the ball game, obviously. And I went down to Mexico City to play this game on a plaza there. It was a large concrete plaza. And there are different versions of the game that people played way back when. Sometimes you would take the ball, you would try to knock it through a stone hoop that was affixed to a wall. Other times it was more you had to knock the ball past your opponent's end line. So there are different versions of the game. And again, we were playing on a concrete plaza there. And they got me kitted up, got my uniform on, stuff like that, similar to what you see here, where I had a pair of shorts on and a leather thong, or leather girdle, I should say, that went around my hips. And the ball they showed me was about yay big, about the size of a volleyball. It was made of rubber, solid rubber all the way through. So it bounced really, really well. In fact, I was surprised at how well it bounced. It bounced just like a basketball. So I was pretty impressed with that. The difference, though, was that because it was solid rubber all the way through, it was very heavy. The ball we were playing weighed about 12 pounds, and they could go up to 15 pounds. So these are very, very heavy balls. Imagine playing a game with a padded bowling ball, and that is essentially what we had. And the really unusual part of the game is that you can kind of get a hint in the picture here, is that you can't use your hands during gameplay except for the initial serve. So you can do that, but beyond that, you cannot use your hands and you cannot use your feet when the two teams are hitting the ball back and forth between each other. So no hands, no feet. The only way you can hit the ball is to use your hip. You have to take your hip like this, put your hands up, and you swing your hip, and you hit it with your hip down there. My instructor told me that I had to just do a Shakira, was the way he put it. So imagine that, swinging your hips, knocking your hips into the ball. That is the only way you can return the ball. And you kind of bounce it back and forth with your hips. And I have to say I wasn't very good at this, but it was fun while the ball was bouncing around. You kind of got in the rhythm, you hit it with your hip. It was heavy, it hurt a little bit, but not too bad. I could get used to that. The unfortunate part of the game is that, again, this ball is very heavy. So eventually it starts losing momentum and rolling along the ground. Stops bouncing and starts rolling along the ground. But even when it's rolling along the ground, you can't use your hands and you cannot use your feet. You still have to use your hip. So what you have to do is you have to drop down on your butt and then use your hip like a pinball paddle and sort of flick it like that. And then you have to hop right back up on your feet. You can't stay on the ground. You have to hop back up. Then the other team hits the ball back. It's rolling back toward you. You have to fall to the ground again and then flick it with your hip. And you just have to keep doing this over and over, getting on the ground, knocking it back, and then popping up to your feet over and over and over. Now, that's the basic gameplay. And then one other thing I should note before I start the reading is that there was a game going on while I was practicing. And there were various people involved. There's a dentist who was playing this game, a physical therapist, just different people in the community who enjoy playing this game. And one of the people there actually brought her 11-year-old daughter along to play as well. So that's kind of setting the scene here as I pull up the section that I'm going to read. So, speaking of which, however unprepared after my practice, I am soon thrust into the match that the others are playing. I am told to choose which team I want to join. Classic playground torment. I glance back and forth, cringing with the knowledge that whichever team I pick will likely lose. Cravenly, I select the side with the 11-year-old girl, hoping she will shoulder some of the blame for our loss. In the version of the game that we are playing, you score points by knocking the ball past your opponent's end line. I quickly realized that this version of the game is really two sports in one, depending on whether the ball is still bouncing or not. When the ball is bouncing, it is a madcap combination of soccer and tennis. As with soccer, you are pressing down the court as a team toward your opponent's goal. But as with tennis, you're batting the ball back and forth. Also, like with tennis, it's a game of angles. You're constantly trying to wrong foot your opponent, either by knocking the ball into awkward spots or making them scurry side to side. Finally, you hip punch the ball in for a score. It is fast, fun, and dynamic. Unfortunately, when the ball loses momentum and starts rolling along the ground, the game deteriorates into Wide World of Sports as presented by Dante. Again, you can only return the ball with your hip, which means throwing yourself to the ground over and over. Imagine doing 100 burpees in a row, except every time you drop, you have to hip punch a bowling ball the other direction. My thighs begin quaking from all the up and down, and my already poor form deteriorates into flailing. My legs are soon so shot that I cannot even enjoy the aerial gameplay. The other team is also now putting weird English on the ball, spinning it like pool sharks. This throws off the timing of my Shakira hip thrusts. One time, the ball slams into my shin. Another time, it blasts my rib cage. And when it smacks my quads once, I crumple onto the ground. Shamefully, I spend the last half of the game hiding behind the 11-year-old child and letting her return shots that were meant for me. In my defense, she is far better than me. She's fearless and agile. I have never before felt like the proverbial little league right fielder, silently begging the other team not to hit the ball my way, making irresponsible promises to God. But that's what the Aztec ball game has reduced me to. So, I didn't make it too long playing that game, I must say. I probably made it about an hour or so, maybe a little bit longer than that. But it was quite difficult to play. But even though I ended up kind of suffering over the next few days, every time I saw a staircase, I was kind of cringing. It was a good lesson in that I learned a lot more, partly because it was so painful, and partly because of this distress that I had to go through. And there were a lot of cases in the book where I was doing some sort of activity, a project, something like that, where it was not fun. It was really hard to tan leather. It was really hard to grind my own grain. It was really hard to make stone tools. But part of the learning process, I think, was the pain and the suffering, was the frustration that I went to. I don't think I would have learned as much had everything been easy, had I gotten it right the first time. So these frustrations, I think, really were an important part of the process and really helped me learn more than I would have otherwise. So however much I suffered at the time, I think this pain and the suffering did pay off for the book in the end. And I want to wrap up with I'm going to go through a few slides here, just some quick highlights of other things I got to do. Sticking with the Aztec theme, I did get to try a bunch of insects that Aztec people got to eat. For the book, I also got to try vicuña. I got to try cuya, or guinea pig. Got to try walrus blubber. Got to try all sorts of different foods. So that was one of the highlights of the book. I got to try out a gigantic trebuchet, so a catapult. This is sitting in Utah right now. I spent a wonderful day with someone throwing these giant garden stones around on a beautiful, beautiful day out in Utah. So that was one of the highlights of the book. I also got to try my hand at some ancient surgery, some ancient medical practices, including trepanation, so getting a hole in the skull. Not sure the slide's showing up there, but, drilling a hole in the skull. Oops. More computer issues here. Sorry about that. Okay. Go to the slide again. But the final story I wanted to talk about involved this right here, something called Bald's Leech Book. So a leech book, leech is an old term for a doctor. So this is essentially a book of recipes that a doctor would use. So powders, tinctures, tonics, elixirs, things like that. And Bald's Leech Book in particular was discovered in a monastery, kind of in a dusty stack of manuscripts. It's about 1,000 years old, and again, contains recipes and treatments that a doctor would use. And as scientists and historians started going over some of these recipes, some of them they knew were obvious nonsense right away. One calls for having a virgin collect water from an eastward flowing spring. And supposedly that cures any ailment of the heart. So not sure how well that one is going to work. But there were a few other ones that they looked at and they said, well, maybe this recipe could work. And in particular, there were two professors at the University of Nottingham in England. One was a professor of Viking Studies, which I thought is a very cool job title, Professor of Viking Studies. And the other one was a microbiologist named Freya Harrison. And so they decided they were going to try this recipe out. It was a cure for styes, which are essentially infected eyelash follicles. And because they're near the eye, they can be dangerous. If the infection spreads, it can get in the eye. It can blind people. or it can even kill people if the infection spreads. And obviously it was more common back then when they didn't have modern medical treatments. So a sty could turn into something fairly serious. And so the particular recipe they used involved mixing wine, onions, garlic, and bile from the gallbladder of an ox. So they looked at this and they said, well, wine that can have an antiseptic, can have antiseptic properties. Onions and garlic, those can have antiseptic properties too. So they said, well, this might work. You take all the ingredients, you mix them together in a copper bowl, you let it seep for 9 days, and then you apply it to the sty with a feather. So they made some of this, and I, in parallel, made some of this with them. You can see the fruits of my labor right here. In one case, I used red wine on the left there, and on the right, I used white wine. And it was fairly easy to find the wine, obviously. Onions and garlic, also no problem. The bile from the gallbladder of an ox, that one was a little tougher, I thought it was going to be, until I started doing a little research, when I found out that this bile, or ox gall, is another name for the bile. Ox gall is actually a fairly common ingredient in modern microbiology labs. It's used to stain bacteria. So essentially, you can apply it to bacteria. It turns some types of bacteria one color. It won't stain others. You can kind of easily sort out which type of bacteria you have in this stain. So it turns out it was very easy. Went on to Amazon, and 2 days later, I had my ox gall. So I took it, mixed it in there, and I didn't have a copper bowl. So I went down to the bank and got 5 shiny, bright pennies because they have a copper coating on the outside. I plucked them in and let the recipe take its course. So after 9 days, here were the results. And you can see things change. The picture isn't the best here. You can see the red wine on the left. It was still red a little bit, but it was more kind of a gray zombie-ish color. It really turned kind of this off-putting color. Whereas the white wine on the right turned this bright sort of copper green, like old Statue of Liberty green kind of color there. You can also see the pennies down there at the bottom. They were all shiny and new at the beginning, like the middle one you can see on the right. But some of these pennies, after the sitting in this solution for 9 days, it looked like I had taken a blowtorch to them. I mean, something was really going on in the reaction here. So something was happening there. But again, in parallel with me doing this, Freya Harrison was also making some of this in England, and she's a microbiologist. So she decided that she was going to try this out on some actual bacteria. And not just any bacteria, she decided to try it on some pretty tough bacterial customers. She tried it on staph, and she also tried it on gonorrhea. And not just regular staph and gonorrhea, but drug-resistant versions of staph and gonorrhea. So she was really putting this stuff to the test. So she got the salve, she put it in with this drug-resistant staph and gonorrhea, and it wiped them out. It really walloped these drug-resistant strains. And that's pretty cool because drug resistance is a growing problem in the modern world. There are a lot of microbes out there that are just resistant to modern drugs. So it's kind of cool that this was actually working and seemed effective for them. But Freya's a good scientist, and she said, well, okay, there's a lot of things that work okay in a test tube, but often when they get into the body, like an actual body, they can fail. And one reason they often fail is because bacteria can form what's called a biofilm. So essentially inside the body, bacteria, they kind of link arms, they glom together, and they secrete this goo. It's a protective goo around them that prevents drugs from actually penetrating and getting down and killing the individual bacteria. So it's a protective layer around them. And Freya said, well, I'm going to make up some biofilms because I know that often one reason drugs fail inside actual living creatures is because these biofilms form. So she made some biofilms, again, of the staph-resistant, or the drug-resistant staph and gonorrhea, applied this salve to them, and once again, it blasted through and wiped out all of these bacteria. which was a pretty exciting and unexpected result. And also kind of humbling in a way that, we're dealing with this major problem nowadays of drug-resistant bacteria. And one tool that we might be able to use has been sitting in this monastery for 1,000 years, and no one really bothered to take a look at it. It was kind of a humbling moment, but a bit of an exciting one too. Because again, I've been talking about, some fun, exciting things we can do in experimental archaeology. We can make mummies and, play the Aztec ball game, stuff like that. But it's a possibility that some of these old ancient remedies could help us out with some of our big modern problems as well. So I just want to wrap up with a few more thoughts here. So at the beginning, I bellyached a little bit about how flat and dull modern archaeology can seem sometimes. Digging in the dirt. I was being a bit dramatic there, obviously. Traditional archaeology is still very important, and I used a lot of it in the book. We know most of what we know about the ancient world because of the patient work of a lot of men and women around the world. So I do appreciate their work. But hopefully, this talk tonight, and the book especially, can show that there's more to archaeology than just moving dirt. If archaeology wants to illuminate the lives of everyday people in the past, then it needs the sights, the sounds, the smells, and the tastes. And I think it can help reveal what unites us today with cultures from long ago, and highlight what humankind has lost in modern times, or at least lost sight of. There's a real cost to being cut off from our heritage. And experimental archaeology certainly is not the easiest field around. I floundered a lot. I failed a lot. I suffered all sorts of Three Stooges injuries. And it's often frustrating and uncomfortable. But the past was not comfortable for our ancestors either. And yet they stuck things out. And in fact, if they had not stuck things out, we would not be here. I think the least we can do is try to understand them on their own terms. And experimental archaeology, living archaeology, can do that better than any other field out there. So again, thank you all for joining me this evening, and I think I am happy to take some questions now. You might be on mute, Bertha.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you. That was great. We do have about 12 questions for you.
Okay, sounds good.
The first question goes back towards the beginning of your talk. Did the tattoo artist use modern inks or the same inks on Ötzi?
He used on himself. They used a mix of different ones, I think, from different eras. I believe they did use sort of a basic soot one. Essentially, you're just mixing soot in with water, maybe a little bit more in there, but they didn't. I don't think they used modern inks in it. No.
Okay, so we have two questions from Kenny Biddle. That is, hi Kenny, our CFI's chief paranormal investigator, who will also be at SciCon. He's talking about the ball game, the Aztec ball game. The ball you mentioned was made of rubber. That's the modern version. And so he wants to know about the rubber in the balls, the ancient version.
Yeah, so essentially they used the same process. They had trees with sap coming out of them, and they would scrape the rubber off the tree, some sort of process to mold it and form it. So we were using, obviously, a modern ball, but we were using it. There's an artisan down there that they go to that makes them according to the ancient ways. So same process, just scraping the sap, the gum off the tree, molding it into a ball, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Modern chemistry in ancient times.
Yeah.
An interesting question also from Kenny. Is the modern mummy the team made for the experiment on display, such as at a museum, for example?
No, it's not. It is in, I didn't mention the other guy's name. His name is Ron Wade. It is in Ron Wade's office right now. Or
okay.
An office. I don't think like sitting behind him. I think it's in like a container of some sort, climate controlled, hot and dry the way that the climate was in Egypt. But yeah, it's in his office or somewhere near his office in Maryland.
Okay, I have when I was in the Yucatan, they talked about the Mayan ball games, and I think you mentioned in Dinner with King Tut the idea that the losers might lose their lives.
Yep.
In the Yucatan, they said the winners would lose their lives. How much
Oh,
evidence do we actually have that players were sacrificed, and how much of that is myth or just later interpretation?
that doesn't incentivize you to play hard if you're if you're
No, I
gonna.
would be like, here, take the ball, here.
Yeah. Whoops, I missed
You
again.
take it. I dropped it.
Yeah. I'm sure there was some exaggeration, but we do know that there were sacrifices. It could be a little different between Mayan and Aztec as well. They might have might have had a little different rules there. But yes, they would sacrifice the losers, not every time, but sometimes. And in some cases, they made captives play. So they would go conquer a territory and make them play. They also used it as training for their own warriors. And of course, if you lost that game, they were going to sacrifice their own warriors. So certainly not every time the losers would be sacrificed, but there were cases where they were, yes.
Oh, interesting. The stories about King Tut's death and the possible genetic disorders were fascinating in the book. Of all the theories you cover, which one made you think, wow, we may never know the real answer here?
Ooh, I think the thing I covered in the book that seems the most mysterious right now is how they built the pyramids. We just do not have any good evidence of what they did. Because they did not use wheels. We know that. The wheel existed then, but at the time they were building the pyramids in that era, they just did not use wheels in Egypt for whatever reason. They didn't have pulleys, so they couldn't have used those. Some people have proposed machines that they might have plausibly built, but there's no evidence for those machines. People have proposed different types of ramps they might have used, but there's a lot of problems with ramps. So I think that really is probably the big outstanding mystery of the field. And experimental archaeology probably can't solve that dilemma. I think it can help rule some ideas out, or at least constrain what we're looking for. So it can play a role, but until we find something, then I don't think it can definitively answer the question. But it can play a role, again, in guiding us and kind of ruling some ideas out. So that, to me, is the big outstanding mystery.
Okay. So it seems like our audience keeps coming back to the Aztec ball game. So let me go back to the Aztec ball game. This Kindle House is still wondering why, when the ball dropped, two people, I guess I'm trying to read the question. I think it's on the screen now. When the ball dropped, two people hip to hip, no one could pick up the ball. It really had to be like your hip being a pinball machine.
Yeah, so a couple things to say about that. One, they considered the ball symbolic of the sun, and so it had to keep moving at all times. If the sun stopped in the sky, they thought the world would end. And it was sort of tied up in the sacrifice and all that kind of thing. But the ball had to keep moving at all times. So if you're stopping two people pinching it between their hips, you're kind of stopping the ball. It's kind of out of the spirit of the game. So that would be one reason. It would not be sportsmanlike to do that, I think. The other reason, though, is that I was not good enough to do this. A few people there were. But if you're pretty good at this game, you can actually get under the ball a little bit and get a little bit of play in it, and they can get it bouncing back and forth. I saw a couple of good players actually get the ball off the ground and doing this. Never hit it to me, though, and I was definitely just like hitting it straight back along the ground. So these skilled players can get it back up eventually.
Interesting. Well, if the sun stopped in the sky, they're kind of right about that. It wouldn't be a very good thing at all.
Not good for us.
So they definitely, with their own astronomical projection there was pretty close to the truth. Okay, putting you on the spot here, but if you could choose one historical figure whose remains scientists could analyze in the future, who would it be? And what questions would you want answered? You could have more than one answer because that's a good question.
I'm going to answer this a little differently in that I have a new book coming out actually about the greatest lost treasures in history. And one chapter in there does talk about lost graves, just graves we don't know, famous people we don't know where they are. And so the one that comes to mind is Genghis Khan's final resting spot. There's this outrageous story about his funeral, and 1,000 warriors accompanied the body up the mountain where he was going to be buried. And they slaughtered everyone they met on the way, and then they buried the body, and they diverted a river over it, and then slaughtered everyone they met on the way back so that no one would know where the final resting spot was. And then they slaughtered all the warriors when they got back so that they couldn't talk about it. Just an outrageous story. Who knows how much of that is true, but we don't really know where he's buried. And just given the pomp and circumstance and the legend of Genghis Khan, that one would be pretty cool to find. I don't know if the body itself would be anything special, but the gravesite was probably pretty amazing. So that one comes to mind, I would say, Genghis Khan.
Yeah. And since we're all supposedly related to him, if you go back
something like 1/6 of people in Asia, at least. I mean, it's just crazy numbers. Yeah.
Or I think us Europeans, it's like William the Conqueror and Charlemagne. We all are related to them.
Oh, yeah.
So in your sections about Mesopotamia and Egyptian artifacts, you often describe material analysis, like detecting metals and pigments. Did you find any instance where the results completely overturned previous assumptions about an artifact's use or meaning?
One thing, going back to tattooing, one thing that archaeologists have struggled with is figuring out, one reason they thought that, Ötzi might have used the cut and rub method was because when you find a needle, that could be used for sewing. It could be an awl. We don't really know what it's for. There's a lot of uses for sharp, pointy things. And we'd never found definitive evidence of a tattoo needle. And archaeologists nowadays, experimental archaeologists, have figured out, they've done experiments where they're tattooing skin or pig skin, and they can look microscopically at the wear patterns on it, and then look at ancient needles we found and look at the wear patterns there and say, aha, okay, this looks like a tattoo needle, not like a sewing needle. So less like overturning the materials and more looking at things we already have in collections and saying, this probably wasn't what we thought. It might have been a tattoo needle. Or we can look at, the wear patterns and figure out different uses for things.
So that leads to this question, like, how much of this real work today happens in labs rather than in the field? What would you say?
Yeah, it's a mix. There are some people who are definitely like hardcore lab geeks who are there gathering data, forming hypotheses, statistical analysis, all that kind of thing. Whereas other people it's more like proof of concept, or they just want to try it out. It gives them a deeper insight into their era or whatever. So probably a mix, probably about 50-50. And one thing that I have been sort of heartened by is that, again, there are people who are just full-time experimental archaeologists. And I talk a bit in the book about how the old guard sort of was very skeptical of the idea of experimental archaeology. They just kind of looked askance at it. But I'm seeing more people do it, and especially incorporating an experiment or two into their larger archaeological dig or something. So they'll have a regular dig site, but they'll try to run a few experiments just to see if they get any insight or just to see how something works. So it's been heartening to see people incorporate this as an additional tool into what they're doing.
I think that's great. You mentioned in the first chapter, I think, that we figured out that ancient people used ash. They rubbed ash on themselves and they put ash in the beds, and it actually suffocated the ticks.
Yeah, this woman in South Africa ran this informal experiment because she found the world's oldest bed. She's a traditional dirt archaeologist, but she got interested and she wondered why there was ash layers essentially underneath these. It was kind of like a sheet of palm leaves or different leaves. And so she said, well, I wonder why they did the ash. And so she said it might be related to insects. And she took a bunch of ticks and put a little like ring of ash and then let the ticks run around and try to burrow through the ash. And most of them suffocated. And the few who got through, their mouth parts were so clogged up with ash, they couldn't bite anyone. So it was a pretty nice, elegant demonstration that this might have been the reason why they would want an ash bed. It was comfortable, but it also could have stopped insects.
I'll remember that next time it gets hot.
It's a good tip, yeah.
Well, folks, we have hit the almost 8 o'clock mark here. It's 7:55. I could keep going. There's so many interesting facts in this book, and I love the anecdotes as well. But I'd like to thank Sam for joining us today and opening this new world that I had no idea about. I hope it was interesting for all of you. And again, if you like this kind of thing and this type of critical thinking and scientific thinking, please join us at SciCon in Buffalo, New York, June 11th through the 14th on 2026. And thank you all for joining us. And Sam, I'd like to give you the last word here.
Well, again, thank you everyone for coming out tonight. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I hope you enjoyed the book as well. It was a lot of fun to write.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.